Okay, so let's talk about kind of this, classically what we talk about the problem of corporate governance. It's this tension between the board of directors of course managers and owners or shareholders. And I kind of like to put them in a little cloud on the outside of all that, the government. And in the middle, I usually put employees. I'll give some more definitions that are in a little bit more depth of what a board of directors is, the managers, all this kind of stuff, because that's the subject of this module. But this is kind of a brief overview of the things that are going on here. So, typically between these five parties, there is seen to be a divergence of interest, right? And the question of corporate governance, a big question of corporate governance, is whose interests should come first. So you've got the owners and shareholders. Corporate governance was, of course, less of a problem historically when you start talking about, the 1700s and before, where a lot of enterprises were owned by manager owners, right? It was Bob's General Store. Bob was the owner. Maybe he had his kids working for him, and that was about the extent of corporate governance in action. The law, of course, had very little say in what Bob was doing in his shop in medieval Europe. Today, and I've talked about this during business history, we have this issue of managers as trustees. So owners of firms delegate a lot of the oversight and the day-to-day running of a firm to the managers. And so they have to trust that the managers are taking actions that are in the best interest of the owners. But of course, managers have their own interests, right? They may not be the owners of the firm, but they want to make sure that they can maximize their compensation and their well-being. And that goal may or may not be in line with that of the owners and the shareholders. Okay? Now, as firms have gotten larger, the diversity of ownership has expanded. I mean, think about, and some of you may actually own stocks. Okay? I know, for example, that I manage my retirement actively, and I buy and sell stocks. Now, I own, a variety of stocks in a variety of companies, but I don't take an active interest in any of them. In fact, I very rarely call into the quarterly earnings reports, all that kind of stuff. Quite frankly, why? Because I'm a professor full-time and I'm doing these videos when I have a little bit of free time on top of that. So I just don't have the time to be managing what's going on in the firm. Now, because there are, in some firms, literally hundreds of thousands of different shareholders owning different proportions of the company, some, 0.010% ownership, and then, of course, in your larger companies, every once in a while you have a shareholder who owns about 5% of the company. I can't simply just delegate managerial responsibilities to management because I own so little of the company, $1,000, $2,000 of a multi-million-dollar company, that I can't really delegate that authority to managers effectively. So the group of people who represent me are the board of directors. So the board of directors, their goal is to collate kind of all the diverse interests of the owners and shareholders and communicate that interest to managers. In other words, they are the ones that represent the owners. They're the faces of the owners with respect to the managers. Okay? A further duty of the board of directors is to compose a company strategy. And then it's the managers, particularly the CEO, the chief executive officer, who execute on that strategy. Of course, as we get a little bit more into this video, or these videos in this module, we'll talk about kind of the debate between should a CEO also be chairman of the board of directors, or should they be two separate positions? That's kind of a debate. There's no real answer to that. Now, of course, another part of this kind of triangle is the employees. Sometimes the employees have, actually frequently the employees have interests that are different from those of the owners, different from those of the managers and different from the board of directors. Because remember, the board of directors, in theory, represent shareholders, but they also have their own interests, which many of the scandals of the 1990s and the early 2000s have illustrated. Board of directors don't always effectively represent shareholders. And then, of course, we have the government here on the outside who are setting the laws and the rules regarding how this relationship should work. So it's a very complex relationship. It's about managing the tension between 5 different sets of stakeholders. Now, there's a couple of key documents that are designed to manage this relationship. And the first, some of you may have actually heard of already, and that's the corporate charter. If I erase that too fast, feel free to rewind the video. And so the corporate charter is a document issued by a state government, not the federal government, and it creates a corporation. Corporate charters just tell you everything you want to know in a very basic sense about a corporation. What's the corporation's purpose? What are the rights and duties of stockholders or owners? What are the rights and duties of directors? And what are the rights and duties of managers? Another key term regarding corporate governance is what we call fiduciary responsibility. And I just talked about it just a little bit with regards to managers as trustees. And fiduciary responsibility is this duty for a representative to manage the property in the interest of the owner. And we can look at that specifically as managers, as trustees. So managers run the firm in the interest of the owners. And to an extent, the board of directors also has that same degree of fiduciary responsibility. Additionally, in a corporate charter, you see a discussion about the number and shares and, of course, classes of stock that be authorized. Are there going to be any dividends or not? Information about the annual shareholder meetings, how big the board should be, and if there's any procedures, well, not only if, but what are the procedures for removing directors. It also has, the corporate charter, what we call bylaws. And bylaws are the rules of corporate governance adopted by corporations. Think of it as like all the amendments to the corporate charter and all the little details located in a corporate charter. Now, states compete pretty vigorously to attract corporations to incorporate in their specific states because there's an incorporation fee, and corporations also have to pay their tax revenues to those states. Now, the joke is Delaware is where more corporations are headquartered than any other state. There's a joke that there are more corporations in Delaware than there are people in Delaware. And you'd think, well, that must be because Delaware has a low incorporation fee or there's low corporate income tax. None of that is it. It's because time and time again, when it comes to legal proceedings, Delaware always tends to not really favor shareholders. They tend to work in favor of directors and managers of the corporations. Other states have lower incorporation fees and lower taxes, but it's Delaware that does the most to protect the management and the board of directors of corporations, perhaps even to the detriment of the owners. Now, the theoretical relationship, as I mentioned, if we're looking at that triangle that I drawn up a little bit earlier in this video, theoretically, federal and state regulation is the most important thing in corporate governance. States, of course, generate the charters and they are reflective of federal regulation. The shareholders, because they're the owners, are really in charge. They tell the board of directors what they want. The board of directors tells the CEO what the shareholders want, and the CEO just goes ahead and executes that. What tends to happen more often, though, is that federal and state guidelines are the most important. The states grant the individual charters. The CEO has a powerful kind of personality who pushes around the board of directors, dictates and executes a strategy, maybe for the benefit of shareholders, maybe not. And so shareholders are actually the recipients of a CEO's action, not the directors of CEO or managerial behavior. Historically, it has been states that have been in charge of corporate governance laws, but the Supreme Court has said that the Constitution empowers Congress to regulate corporations if it chooses. And it has chosen a few times, particularly with a lot of the crises that have stemmed from the late 1990s and also early to mid 2000s. We'll talk about some of these crises in the next video. I'll see you then.